All right, welcome to Cowboy Church Accounting, the sexy part of Cowboy Church, right? No, the truth is nobody got into church for numbers. We all got into church to spread the gospel in one way or another, but money's important, right? It takes money to spread the kingdom. And one of the things that Jeff Bishop likes to say is, who controls the money at church? Because the truth is, whoever controls the money at church controls the money at church, right? And by that, you control church, right, when you control the money. So Cowboy Church accounting is simple. It's like accounting for anything else, but it's a very important part. Because if you go to get some money and you don't have any, and you're trying to do some kingdom-minded business, it's not a good thing, is it, right? None of us like to not have any money at the end of the day. How many pastors we have in here? Any? See, pastors don't care one iota about money. That's the truth, does he? Well, you have to. I think it's important because we're called as shepherds, and so shepherding means shepherding our resources as well as our people. So it's important that we that we focus on that. The main thing with accounting is to have a system in place, to have some kind of system. In the beginning, it can be as easy as an Excel spreadsheet, but there's all kinds of accounting software out there. Just some quick examples are QuickBooks, Flockbase, Church Pro, and one called Realm. And they're the most commonly used by churches that affiliate with us anyway. And there are some things to consider when you're selecting a software program. Number one is the experience of the person running the program, right? You don't want to give somebody something that there's a huge learning curve for if they have no idea about how to run a basic accounting software program, because it just won't happen, right? It'll just get difficult, things will get done wrong, and it's really hard to go back and make those things right. And does it have the means to set up everything you need? Because at churches, we use different funds. And a fund isn't necessarily an account, but it's where we account for that money, right? So you might have a youth fund, you might have a building fund, you might have a general fund within your church. They may all share one bank account, but you'll still have various funds inside your church. And does it allow you to create a line item budget within that program? That becomes really important because, as you'll learn later on today in the budgeting process class that we're going to do, that it is important that we have a budget and that we operate from a budget, but you can't have one if your system doesn't allow you to create one. You need to be able to track donor gifts, because we give giving statements at the end of the year to everybody who donated to our churches. So it's important to be able to do that. It's important to be able to spit out reports that everybody can look at that make sense quickly. As a pastor of a church, I get 3 things every Monday morning. I get the number of people that were in the church, I get what the total tithes and offerings were, and what the account balances are in all of our accounts. I do that because those are important numbers for us to track, because it helps us track the health of the church by doing that. And it allows us also to react to seasonal activities. Churches are up in the fall, up in the spring, they kind of follow the school year. So we can track that and we can forecast and do things that way. Do y'all all use an accounting software system of some kind? What do you use? QuickBooks. QuickBooks is the most common. It's the most popular. And the reason it makes it easy, it's used in so many areas of private industry as well as churches. So that makes it a lot easier. Most of your volunteers can figure out how to operate that. We should have adequate bank accounts to meet whatever the ministry needs are of your church. I think does everybody have a checking account at their church? Yep, should. You got to meet the needs of all your teams, all your ministries, everything you want to do. We got to make sure the money's there to do that. And another really important thing is with that software program, it needs to be able to reconcile all of your accounts. If you do have multiple bank accounts, you need to just go in and not have to do all that by hand, right? And it just spits you out a report of what's available there. It's important that we always recommend a church have 2 bank accounts. You're going to need a checking account, and then a savings account is a good idea. Because if we're being good stewards of God's money, and we can set some money aside and allow it to grow until we need it, then that's what we need to do. And that's how we become good stewards of God's money. maintaining accounting records and overseeing the whole thing, right? The pastor is the administrator of the church. The pastor's always going to be the administrator of the church. So it was taught for years that pastors didn't need to know anything about the finances of the church. I personally disagree. I think the pastor needs to know what the funds are available at the church, what the money's being spent on at the church, all that. One thing he doesn't need to know, in my opinion, right? Some churches are different, but I don't think a pastor needs to know what individual donations are, because it can cause you to look at people differently, right? So there are some occasions where I want to know. If someone was a big giver and they've just stopped, then I want to know that, because it might be a case where they've got some financial problems and we need to get involved in their life and see what we can do to fix that, right? It's only a ministry opportunity, which is the only reason I would ever ask our church who was giving anything. But you got to put the pastor in a position. He doesn't necessarily need to be able to write checks. He doesn't necessarily need to be a signer on the account, but he certainly, at the very least, needs to access whatever the online banking system is and know how much money's in there at any one given time. It's important because we've had wrecks in Cowboy churches because of that. Because pastors are completely separated from all that. We've had occasions where a church secretary would run off with some money, and if you run off with little bits of money at a time, it's easy to get away with that if nobody's monitoring that, right? So somebody needs to monitor it, and your pastor, as the shepherd of the flock, as the general administrator of the church, that's his responsibility to make sure that there's funds there to do what you need to do. All the funds should be designated by the pastor and the elders, right? All the big money needs to run through the pastors and the elders. They need to designate what funds you have, and they should assist some churches call them, what do y'all call your stewardship team, audit team, finance team? I think we all have different names for them. We all call ours audit too. And I don't know if that's correct or not, right? Because the word audit leads you to believe somebody's going to come in and audit your books, right? And that's not really what they do. They just track the money, they count the money, they deposit in the bank, they do all of those things. But you need to have somebody in place on that financial team to do that. But I think stewardship is a perfect name for that team, because that's what you're doing, is you're stewarding the resources that God gave us, right? We're supposed to steward His people, His resources, and all the things He entrusts us with. In the absence of a steward team, if you don't have one, the elders have to make that up. In the meantime, it should always be somebody looking at the money at church. That stewardship team will be responsible for continually reviewing the accounting process. This is one of those things that needs to be tweaked all the time, because as income increases and decreases, right, you deal with that differently. You look at it differently. A church that has any startup churches in here? When you plant a church, right, there's no money, no people, right? So you're doing what you have to do to get by. But once a church reaches the size of a Cross Brand or a Stillwaters or one of those, then the way you react to things with money is different, because there's money, right? That's what makes the difference. There is money. But they're responsible for reviewing the accounting process, and it can include verifying that all bank accounts have been reconciled every month. That should always be done. If we're ever in a position when it's tax time that we got to go back and redo last year's books because we didn't keep track of them, then we're not being very good stewards, right? We got to keep track of that as it goes. They're also responsible for making sure we're on track with our federal reporting, with our payroll reporting for the state, if we have to do any of those things. Does anybody use an accountant in here? So that's what we do, right? We use we track all of our stuff, but we turn it all into a CPA at the end of the year. Because I don't know if you know it or not, but churches are tax exempt, right? By nature, right? We're exempt from paying federal income tax. That does not mean that we're exempt from filing income tax, right? And I don't know if you've seen all that stuff we got to file, but it's It's more than I want to keep track of. They need to make sure that the church is following whatever your approved budget process is, and then the pastor and the elders need to be involved with in that, because it's our responsibility to make sure that all these teams are staying within budget. And I'm assuming everybody works off of a budget, right? Everybody understands budgets, and so another thing churches will have is an administrative assistant, a secretary, a financial administrator, whoever has the responsibility of entering the data into that system, right? And that's a very important role, because the old saying is garbage in, garbage out, right? And we've all worked in some kind of system where everything was entered into it wrong in the beginning, and it's almost easier to scrap the thing and start all over than it is to get it right, right? So it's important that we get it right in the very beginning. We're recording deposits and contributions from donors, all of our year-to-year reports, printing financial reports for the pastors and elders. Do you guys give your pastors and elders, do they have a meeting in which they ask you for financial reports? Okay, good, they should. But if you can't get to those reports, then that's kind of a miserable deal, isn't it? Because then you're back to trying to recreate it every time before you give it to them, and that's just not pleasant. And so we're finding churches that also have another team attached to a stewardship team that's responsible for collections and donations and all the things that go with that. So most of you, I would imagine, have bylaws at your churches that say you need 2 people to count money. You have to have deposits made by a certain day of the week, and all of those things. And that's just to make sure that all that gets in there. Because there's nothing worse than having a guy call you and say, look, I tithed 3 weeks ago and that check hadn't been cashed yet, right? And then it's not fair to them because they're trying to manage their finances too. But we got to track all that stuff. And at no time here's what we see a lot of cases. The donation should never be taken to anybody's house, right? That's just bad practice to start. They need to go from the church to the bank, right? Church be locked up in the office till Monday when you can deposit or whatever the case may be, but they don't need to be running off to somebody's house. Again, I know in the beginning you got to do what you got to do, right? But it's never good process. Suggestions on how to handle gifts and donations. Budget's number one. We got to have a budget, and we're going to discuss that more in depth in a later session. But the approved budget is a guideline for what the church is going to do, because we don't have that money in the budget when we build that budget, right? We've got to say, just for a round number, we got a $100,000 budget because that's our forecast for what the church's revenue is going to be in a year. That money ain't in there, so we can't run out and spend that $100,000, right? So it's a guideline on what we're trying to do. And it's developed, approved, and presented by the pastors and elders, and again, we'll go into that deeper. And record keeping. Church leadership is responsible for keeping accurate and adequate financial records. That's extremely important because none of us as churches or anybody else want to be, you don't want to be involved with the IRS, do you? Nobody wants to have those conversations. They're not pleasant at all. All these records should include the current budget, the chart of your accounts, whatever accounts that you have, because most churches, again, will have at least 2 accounts, and there's no telling how many accounts a church of this size has, right? Most of us have a building fund or a third account. Some of us have a separate youth account, and all of that is fine if you do. But these records should include that, current budget, chart of accounts, a general ledger, what your contributions have been, and those contributions have got to be kept confidential. We've got to keep that information where it's not everybody's business, right? The only people that need to see that, again, are the folks that are counting money, depositing it, and doing year-end reports, giving statements, and that sort of thing. Nobody likes to talk about profit and loss when it comes to churches, right? But the truth is, we need to bring, if we're going to complete our mission, we got to have more revenue than we have cash going out, right? So it's important to keep track of those things. and then reconcile those reports to whatever you need to have. You need to know your budget to actual, right? What do we budget for this line item, and what do we actually spend on this line item? And we strongly suggest having an accounting or record-keeping software. I'm an Excel junkie. I've worked in Excel all my life, and I find it easy, but a lot of people don't. The drawback with something like Excel is anybody that's worked in it much knows that you can spend a year building this big, nice, fancy workbook only to have somebody come along and not know what they're doing and mess up every formula that's in that workbook, right? And then all your work is just gone. So QuickBooks or something like that is a really good idea for that kind of stuff. And again, those reports that come out of there should be available to the pastors, the elders, the steward team, and the team leaders whenever they request those reports. Because it's only fair for a team leader to come to you and say, hey, I had X amount of dollars at the first of the year. Could you tell me what we got now as we continue forward? And you'll really see that with arena teams and who always run out of budget and all of that kind of stuff. Any arena team folks in here? And that's the only one really we ever have that problem with. Year-end contribution reports that you give to your folks, they should be made available. We recommend following the tax year, right? So you've got to make all W-2s and all 1099s. You've got to have all those sent out by the 31st. We recommend that you just follow the same timing for your giving reports and your contribution reports and that sort of thing.
Do you mail those out, or do you hand them out?
So you can do them, churches do them multiple ways. What we do is we mail the ones we have addresses for, and then the rest of them we just keep at church, and if you ask for one, because some people don't care, right? And the truth is they're important because people need to know what they gave, but they're unimportant to the IRS because most people don't really give enough that they can take advantage of it on their taxes anyway, because that contribution limit is so high that most people don't ever get into that. But so we do a little all of it, mail it, and because you're not going to keep everybody's address, right? I mean, we all got church management systems, but I guarantee you there's not a third of those addresses in there that are right, because nobody goes in and changes it if they move or does any of that stuff. So those are hard to track. Any questions so far? That way we don't get to the end and have a big long list. I had to go back and look. So who understands undesignated, restricted, and designated gifts? Everybody pretty confident about that? Because I'm not always. It gets a little confusing sometimes. And there's a huge difference between those. Each of these has a specific fund in your accounting records, and some may be placed in a specific bank account. If you have a building fund, right? If you have people given to that, that's going to go into its own account, right? If you're raising money for something else specific and you have an account for that, it's going directly into that account. But it does get difficult. Undesignated gifts or tithes, offerings, gifts that you receive that are placed in a general revenue account. Money in this fund is used to provide financial resources for the budgeted expenses, and the church here's the biggest thing, the church gets to determine how those funds are spent, right? We get to make that decision as a church. Once we get into restricted gifts and designated gifts, it gets just a tad bit different. So restricted gifts are funds, because restricted and designated sounds a lot alike, right? So we'll try to clear that up a little bit. A restricted church fund refers to a donation given to the church that can only be used for a specific predetermined purpose as designated by the donor, meaning the church is legally obligated to use the money solely for that stated purpose and cannot apply it to general operations or other church initiatives. Essentially, it's a donation with limitations on how it can be used and spent. The restricted fund does not have a time limit for reallocation. So if don't let somebody, or you can do what you want, but I wouldn't suggest letting somebody write a check for blue chairs, because you're going to have to buy blue chairs with that, or just sit on that money for the history, the rest of the time of the church, because we don't have any way to do anything else with those funds. And a designated gift. The leadership of the church may at some point designated money to be set aside for specific needs, events, programs. Most of those designated funds have an end date, right? We're going to collect it for so long. Maybe you're raising money for the youth. Maybe you're, and I don't want to get into fundraising and that sort of stuff right now, because that's a total different deal, and we'll talk about that during the tax compliance thing, because that gets really complicated, because there's so many gray areas when it comes to that. But there's not, when it comes to restricted funds, there's no gray area there. If somebody tells you you have to use that money for something, then you have to use that money for something. Now, if you've got a building fund and somebody donates money to that building fund, it's the church's decision how they spend that money within the building fund. But again, somebody donates to the building fund and says, for blue chairs, you got to buy blue chairs, right? And you may have all red chairs, so that blue chair is not going to look very good in your church, right? So we just want to be cautious about that. If somebody comes up and says, hey, I just came into some money from whatever reason, and in Cowboy Church, there's no telling where that money came from, right? But and they say, look, I want to give this for something, right? Well, that's fine, but why don't you trust us? And you got to find the gentlest way possible to say it. Why don't you trust us with how that money gets spent, right? Because your church leadership probably has a better idea on where that money's best spent, right, than somebody sitting in the congregation. So that's the biggest difference. We get to determine where that money goes, provided it's not restricted. To sum up the differences, it's about control. It's about 100% about control. And I don't know if you know it or not, but you got people in your churches that want control, right? And then pastors, we're the worst of the worst about wanting to control everything. But that's the biggest difference, is control. Budget controls the money that's expended. If you accept restricted gifts and allow it to establish a restricted fund, that leaves control of how the money's spent in the hands of whoever's writing the check, right? Anybody come from a denominational background, right? I think a lot of us came from Baptist churches and other places. Have y'all ever seen the fights that take place in church over money? Part of the reason Cowboy Church is set up from an accounting standpoint the way it is to avoid those fights, right? I've seen some crazy fights over the color of carpet. I've seen churches split over lights, over what kind of lights are going to be in the church. So we got to be cautious about that, right? We want to avoid division in our churches, and that's got to be money too, right? We got to watch for that. But we just need to allocate that money where it needs to be allocated. Undesignated funds are controlled by the budget and church leadership. This is just a recap. Restricted funds are controlled by the person donating the money. And designated funds are controlled by the leadership team or those who are asked to do it, right? If we've got designated funds going to the youth, then they get to determine how that money gets spent within that youth team. Or the arena team, they get to decide how that money's spent within the parameters of what it is they do. Fundraising. Anybody do much fundraising? Okay. So the biblical approach, churches are designed, God's design for the church, right, is that it be financed through tithes and offerings, right, through people's free will giving in church. But I do understand that there are reasons that sometimes people will do fundraisers and that sort of stuff. But it should be thoroughly thought through, prayed through, if that's the best way to go with whatever you're trying to accomplish. Because sometimes you'll try to raise specific amount of money to do something, right? Camp time for kids is a big one, right? I think we all have fundraisers for kids to go to camp. And I think one reason you should do it is because your youth need to be involved, right? They need to somehow support what they're trying to do, which is going to camp. And we all need to teach kids some responsibility, right? And that's just one of those ways to do that. So some of those gifts could be considered restricted and some not. But some states have very specific guidelines for nonprofits, particularly religious organizations, and the frequency and the type of fundraisers allowed. And we recommend that you consult your state Department of Commerce for details and limitations, because there are some. There are going to be limits on the types of fundraisers you can have. There are going to be legal limits on the number of fundraisers you can have within a year. And then you get into all kinds of gray areas about, was it just one fundraiser? If say a state says one fundraiser a year, well, does that just mean one fundraiser for every fund we're raising for, or does that just mean one as a church, right? It's all gray. So it's best that you check with whoever your state entity is and figure that out. Checks, debit cards, and signers. The administrative staff and other designated individuals are going to be responsible. We make somebody responsible for spending money at church, right? The bills got to get paid, so somebody's got to write the check. A couple of people got to sign the checks. There's countless people now who won't accept a check, or you don't have time to give them a check, right? So it's going to be done with a credit card, a debit card, and how's all that designed to work, right? It gets a little... The farther we go down the road with technology, the more convoluted this all gets, right? And the farther we go down with government control, the more convoluted this gets. So we try to simplify it as much as we can. In some cases, 2 signatures are required on checks. That's historically the way all church checking accounts are set up. We got a call from our bank about 3 weeks ago that said, you can keep putting these 2 signatures on a check if you want to, but we're not verifying any of it, right? Really? No, it's what our bank told us. Yeah, they're not verifying. So,
we have 1 signature on ours.
Yeah.
But
so
we also live in a tiny town.
Right, right. I still think it's good for us to have 2 signers on a check, right? It just cuts out some of the stuff that could go on inside our little groups. But just so you know, the bank's probably not checking, right? You might check with your bank, but ours sure said we're not. And it blew my mind, because I don't know why they allow you to set up a 2-signature account and make everybody come in and sign these silly signature cards. We had to change some signature cards during COVID. And our bank made us stand in the drive-through lane outside in a group and sign these signature cards while they stayed inside and watched us through the window. So it's crazy. But anyway, ours, they don't care how many checks are on there, how many are on there anymore. But regardless of how many, that needs to be designated who it is in the beginning. And electronic bank transfers are another big thing nowadays, right? We've got all kinds of people we owe money to that just suck money straight out of the account every month. Actually, I like it. It's the easier way to go. It's hard with an organization, though, that depends on donations, because sometimes it's hard to forecast those funds, and you can't always tell what's going to be there. But that's another way that they're doing it. But prior approval from pastors and elders, or those enlisted to control your finances, should exist there. And funds, does everybody have a reimbursement policy at their church? Because if you don't, you need one, right? You need to go home and start that now. We don't pay anybody, we don't reimburse anybody unless you can provide a receipt. You can't tell us you went to Walmart and bought paper plates and just show up with the plates, right? You have to bring a receipt, and then you can be reimbursed for that kind of stuff. And for reoccurring expenses, utility bills, all of that, that's just going to be what it is. It's going to be money that you owe every month, that we have to pay it, and so we'll just pay that the way it is. And we should have an accountable reimbursement plan, like we discussed, in accordance with what the IRS says, right? The IRS has a rule for what they will pay for mileage and all that stuff. So we need to know that. We need to put that in place. That way there's no confusion down the road. I think one of the fears when you plant a church, and we planted ours, is if you start out thinking small, it's hard to ever react when your church blows up. But if you'll start out thinking that way, then thinking like it's a big church, then it's a lot easier to manage the funds because you've got something in place to help you manage that activity. And that's IRS regulation 1.162-17, just so you know, if you want to go look that up. We're only going to, as churches, reimburse reasonable ministry-related expenses, right? We're not paying everybody's bills. And they're incurred by a minister or somebody on staff or somebody that you have designated to go do a certain thing. And they're subject to budget limitations, right? You can't just go out. You need to look at the budget before you go buy something or before you go participate in some kind of transaction. You need to know how much money is budgeted for that. But we should, if somebody's using their car for church business, then we should reimburse them for their mileage, right? We should do all of those things as churches. If we send somebody to a conference like this, right, we ought to, and I'll just tell you what we do. We don't pay people to come to these conferences, but we do cover your hotel rooms if you come to these conferences. And we require all of our leadership to go to at least one of these schools a year, just because we think it's awesome. Everybody leaves here so fired up. That's the main thing, right? But there's a lot of information to be gathered here too. But we need to compensate them if we're asking them to travel on behalf of our churches. Or if it's for business training, schools, meeting expenses, books, software, media supplies, if it's related to ministry or if they work for the church. Entertainment, hospitality, if it has a business connection and if they meet that connection requirement. Cell phone charges. But again, we have to have a process in place. We just need to be fair with people, right? If you're willing to reimburse them for something, they need to know it in advance. And if we're not willing to reimburse them for something else specific, then we need to let them know that in advance too, I think. And we're working on a new deal. When you get up and walk out, you'll see a QR code laying right over there on that table. So I'd ask everybody to scan that QR code. That will give us your information. And then anything we have to relate to you in the future about the classes that you've attended, because that will identify you as being in this class. So then we can send out information based on that if there's anything new that comes up that you might need to know or we think you'd want to know. Biblical stewardship. The Bible speaks a lot about how we manage our time, our talents, and our resources. There aren't any pastors in here, but I want to say you need to encourage your pastor not to be afraid to preach on those things. Biblical giving is a real thing. The Bible talks about money and things and possessions a whole lot, so we can't be afraid to teach about that. We strive to break down barriers at Cowboy Church and eliminate things that kept people from hearing and being obedient to the Word of God, right? There's nothing worse than, here's what I find about tithing or generosity or however your church refers to it as. People that don't participate in it don't know why we do it, right? That's the biggest thing. They don't understand that it's actually a part of our worship, right? It's actually a part of our relationship with Jesus. And so once they do, they'll understand it. But I want to read a couple things. Psalms chapter 24, verse 1 says, "The earth is the Lord's and everything in it, the world and all its people belong to Him." That means they're treasures, right? Or Colossians chapter 3, verse 17, "And whatever you do or say, do it as a representative of the Lord Jesus, giving thanks through Him to God the Father." 2 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 6 and 7. Remember this: a farmer who plants only a few seeds will get a small crop, but the one who plants generously will get a generous crop. You must each decide in your own hearts how much to give, and don't give reluctantly or in response to pressure, for God loves a person who gives cheerfully. Matthew chapter 25, verses 14 through 30. Jesus teaches us about being good stewards in the parable of the talents. And I think everybody knows that. So I'm not going to read all of that. But I do think everybody everybody understands what that means. So, look, giving is biblical. It's extremely biblical, right? And it's also the way that we should think about financing kingdom activities, right? Anything to grow our church, to expand our church, all of that should be accomplished through biblical giving. So I just encourage you to encourage your pastor not to be afraid to talk about those things. I'm sure you're not. I'm sure everybody in here has got a bold pastor and they stand up and gladly preach about those things. Any questions? Got to be some.
What's your name?
Wayne Walling, I'm sorry.
And where are you out of?
Lampasas, Texas, Open Gate Cowboy Church. I also sit on the board of directors for the American Fellowship of Cowboy Churches. That's the easiest question I'm going to get all day.
I just wait on the tax part.
Yeah, yes, ma'am.
We recently had a meeting with a bookkeeper who we are going to start just using just to kind of oversee things maybe at the end of the year, because we're a really small church. We started a couple of years ago. And she was talking about whether or not the pastor and secretary should be paid with just do a 1099 at the end of the year, or if we should W-2.
We will go into this during the tax compliance part, but I will tell you so the IRS has, I forget the number of criteria you have to meet to be considered a W-2 employee, and I will promise you your pastor meets that. Because so it should be a W-2, right? And the number one requirement is, you might not think he does, but your pastor has office hours. Because your church meets at a certain time every Sunday and he's got to be there, right? So he has office hours, so it should be a 1099. I mean, excuse me, a W-2. I apologize. Edit that. What else we got? We done?
I'll ask you a real quick one.
Sure.
You mentioned that the money should not go to someone's house. The money should go from the church office to the bank. Well, we don't really have a church office. We have a little building that was donated for us to use until we have a permanent home, and there's really no safe place to put it. So right now, it does go to a home, and then it does go to the bank.
So,
Bank drop? Like we bank drop ours. Our bank provided us with free charge for a locked bank bag. And so me, since I'm the secretary, or I have 3 people on our finance, we call the finance team, that counts my money every Sunday. And it might not be that for y'all to have that many people, but we have a locked bank bag. They put the offerings or donations or whatever in there with a deposit slip. They lock it up. Either me or those 3 people will take it to the bank deposit and drop it every Sunday.
Our bank is in a different town.
Oh, well,
and
may
so-
not work, I guess, for that,
The only thing I see about that would be a problem for us is the recording of those contributions is done at my house. We don't have an office at the building that we use. We don't have a way to have the computer, you know what I mean? So it's,
we don't use a computer. I mean, ours is all by hand, but I mean, if your bank would allow you to get a bank bag, or even they have plastic bags that you can seal, or take it to the bank and count it there with them, that's just what we started doing. We never really had a secretary at our church until this last August, and we've been a church for 20 years.
oh wow.
So our finances were a little, but that was the only way I could hold them accountable, was getting a locked bank bag, because to me that's better, or a sealed bag of some sort. You put all your stuff in there and seal it, then go to the bank, and it's an option. I mean, I don't know if you can do that too, but it holds you all accountable that it's all sealed.
Whatever you do, there's three things to consider, right? Accountability, number 1, safety of the money, number 2, and avoiding the appearance of mispropriety is a big deal too, right? So that's it, right? And a lot of that is going to depend on what your bank allows, how often you can get to the bank, all of those things, but a lot on your congregation too, right? I mean, so I would say if you can't keep the money locked in an office, then you got to take it to the safest place possible, right? Wherever that is. Yeah. And I'm assuming you have multiple people that are involved in counting the money, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, what we have to.
Right. And that's all it needs.
And we initial, you know, what we've got, and then typically it just goes to my house, and then the next day, after putting it into the system, take it to the bank.
Yeah, and so all I would tell you is you're doing the perfect thing, counting money with two people. The only thing I would tell you is just as soon as you can get away from doing something at your house and having that money at your house, do that, right?
Yeah.
That's it. That's all. That'd be my only recommendation.
You're still at home by yourself. kind of
Right,
thing,
yeah,
and then
just
taking it to
the
bank.
appearance of.
Exactly. Exactly.
If anybody ever had to prove a fit, you would not be able to prove that you can do
Exactly,
it.
that's very
All
true.
comes down to you.
That's very true.
Just need to
Absolutely.
make sure you have your bank deposit receipt that matches your tithing sheet.
Yeah.
Make those together, that's very crucial.
Yeah.
If you're gonna do
We
that.
also, we count our money, our cash, and we have 5 5s, and we have 20 20s, you know, whatever.
Oh, okay.
So we know exactly what kind of cash we
Yeah.
have.
That's what they do at our church too. They do the same thing.
That's just covering yourself.
Yeah, yeah,
Right.
that's all good information. Okay. Thank y'all.
Yeah,
I have
and we
a
make
question.
copies of everything.
Sure.
On the restricted and designated. So this came up this last year. We had a women's conference and there was a fee to attend. And after that, that money was gonna just be dropped into, anything left over goes into women's ministry is what our audit team, desired. We had a lady come up and ask us about that because she said, I think she was just trying to cause trouble. But
No, not in church.
she was like, you can't use that money for anything else except for that one women's conference. And I said, well, that wasn't even
Makes sense.
a donation. That's like saying you buy something and tell somebody how they can, use it. So it kind of caused some problems, but just to cover the bases, I went and asked enough people that attended that had, paid if they were okay with that money being used for other women's ministry. And because that's what I found from reading that you would do if it wasn't an actual restricted amount, you can go back to that donor and ask them, can we use this for this or something else? But, I mean, that's really not, if you, just like an arena event, if we take in an entry fee, that's not in any way gonna be a restricted amount.
No, the only thing, in the case you're talking about, the only thing that would make that fund restricted or that amount of money restricted is if somebody wrote you a specific check, said this is for XYZ women's ministry, right? And that was all it was for. If it's not designated that way, it's not designated, right? I mean, it may have been designated to the women's ministry, but it's up to the leadership of the women's ministry to distribute those funds however they see fit.
But anytime somebody gives something that is for something specific, that's gonna be something that they're just giving. They're not purchasing something
Right.
or paying for a conference or an entry fee, or you can't actually make those. Our church actually does it different. I mean, we have those funds, but somehow we got started, and I started from Deanna Crossbrand, but we call it restricted funds, and then the designated, and I understand it's different, but that's just what we call them. But the designated is when someone says, this can only be used for this. But if someone is purchasing something, or if they're paying an entry fee, they cannot actually say that can only be used for this.
Right. No. Yeah, you're right. So, and as far as the language used, my recommendation would be to follow the language the IRS uses, right? Because that's all that matters at the end of the day, right?
Well, and that came up too, and I had to do a whole lot of studying on that. And it gets very confusing because you read all this stuff and then it says, this may be different for charitable or religious. And I'm like, oh.
and it is a lot of times, right?
What we ended up doing because of that is, and I talked to Deanne, and she suggested this and said it's what Crossbrand does now. But at the bottom of everything, even if it's a fundraiser or whatever, that you put a little blurb that anything left over after this is done is at the discretion of the church. And then that way.
Yeah, and I don't know, the answer exists, and it will come out in the meeting this afternoon on tax compliance, right? Because, so I'll let you know a little secret. So Jeff Bishop, the director of the AFCC, his wife, Kim, is going to teach that class. She is a CPA, she's a CFO of a company. She's smarter than we are, right? I mean, end of the day, that's just the truth.
And the more you read that stuff, the dumber I feel.
I feel you.
That's what they designed it for.
They did. Yeah, if they didn't, it's hard to believe they didn't, right? Yeah. Any other accounting related stuff?
What about, we have leased a color copier, and that's great, boy, it's wonderful. But now all the different teams are making copies, and that's great, but that price is going up each month. So, do I charge each team for their copies? And if so, how do I do that?
No, I don't think so. I think you just got to drop that into whatever part of your budget is in there, right? And you know that you've outrun that for this year already, or that you're going to. So you just have to do the best you can and just make accommodations for it next year.
We do make a whole bunch of divide ours up amongst things. We know what it is per cup. Coffee. Just like we did an event like this one, we made 2,000 color copies. Well, that's going to be around $700, and we do charge that team that comes to that individual team budget.
Well,
the stuff is, but this place is pretty huge. We have to do that. But
Well, this is new. We've only
Right.
had this copier, for maybe a year, and so now
I think I want the copier.
yeah, it's awesome, man.
Ours has a number on it, so like if
And
it's
see, mine
yours
probably
should be
does.
able to too. Like we
Yeah.
lease ours.
Yeah.
We haven't in the past leased it because they thought it was cheaper to just buy it outright. Well, the maintenance and everything on top of it became a little bit more than what we should have been budgeting and spent, so we changed it up this year. But on there, each person has a number. On the leaders, they're the only ones that make the copy, or the kids that make it for the youth, they know the number. And so then I can go in there and say, youth used 2,000 colored copies or whatever,
Yeah.
which we never will do that in our whole church, but
Yeah.
it shows you, and it'll break it down on what number, who used what, so.
And so do you
can
charge
that.
it back to that team?
No, I don't charge it to them, I just kind of like he says, we have say youth has $8,000.
Yeah.
Well, then you take that, $700 or whatever from the youth budget and you show what they've spent. So
Oh,
each
okay.
time, like I have a budgeted line for everybody and every leader, and they have everything, and I keep up with their expenses every month. And so, that's why I use QuickBooks, because it's easier to just type it in there, and it reconciles, because it's connected to our accounts. We have a savings account and we have a spending account, so it all is on there. So it just makes it easier for you each month or week, or however you give your pastor, or whoever, your reports, so.
And it stops people from making multiple copies, or you have to go in there and know that I only need 100 copies and that they're charging me this much money, and then you don't have other people from the church coming in or outside coming in making copies.
Well, and you're also going to have those, the youth, for example, sitting in a leadership team meeting, and you say, what are you doing with all these copies, right?
Exactly.
So, there's some accountability there by having that number.
Knowing that how much they cost per copy, they didn't pay attention to what they're doing.
I mean, but mistakes get made. I mean, because I'm honestly, a month ago, I made an accidental mistake. Something was misspelled in the bulletin, and they were like, oh, no, you aren't fix that. I'm like, well, that's 55 colored copies. I was like, well, I'm just going to go back and do it in black and white. And then they got mad at me for doing it in black and white. I was trying to save money.
You're never going to win that bulletin fight, ever. It doesn't matter.
Never.
If we could do away with bulletins, I'd do it in a heartbeat.
Amen.
Ours are always black and white, but I printed them in color accidentally, and I did like 200. And the guy that was the previous audit team leader came to me and said, are we really doing well in the church funds this week? Not anymore. Just spend it all in color.
Don't you find it amazing, though, how few times you have to do something in a church before everybody expects it to be done that way from now on, right? One color copy will make them expect a color copy from then on.
Or you make a mistake on a bulletin, they are so quick to let you know.
We don't know
I
anything
just
about
tell
that.
them, listen, if you've got a problem with it, I'll give you the file
Yeah.
and you can do it next time. Because I put the wrong date a lot of times, I forget to change it.
Yeah, I put a 0 on our attendance, and so we had like 1,700 and
Wow.
175.
Wow, that's great.
But yeah, they let me know real fast.
I bet they did. Yes, ma'am.
Well, this is kind of off your topic, but what do you use to do your bulletins? What program do you use to do your bulletins?
I use Publisher.
I just use Word.
I just
Yeah, I just use
use
Word too.
Ours is very
It might be
simple.
something better.
I used to
No.
use Word, but we had Publisher, and is it easier?
Easier.
Is it? I love it.
Let me run
And
it.
you
Hang on.
can, I make my flyers off of it too. You can, it's got layers that you can do.
This is the lady that does it, and I know she struggles
Program
with
to
it.
make bulletins.
I use Canva. Now, I don't know how to use it. I'm learning.
That's what we do for our
flyers is Canva.
Yeah, we just started
Yeah.
using Canva and I'm still learning how to use it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm
too.
doing all
I've used
YouTube. Yeah.
PowerPoint, I've used Publisher, I've used Process.
I push myself in when I'm not pushing him, I'm rocking myself.
Regular Microsoft Office, you have to buy an Office thing or get it added.
Yeah.
What else we got? We should. That's a class that should exist here, right? Graphic design.
Yes, yes.
I kind of go along with that social media that we're having later because I may be, I feel like I'm young, but I'm definitely not in my 40s going, oh my gosh, asking my teenagers, how do you do this? They're like, Mom.
Yeah. And then somebody in your church, whoever's good at it, becomes the boss of it, right? And then it gets crazier even.
Then they spend more money.
Yeah. But so the accounting is, church accounting is important, right? Because, and I don't want to step on any of the compliance stuff they're going to talk about later. But number one, she knows more about it than I do. But I just don't want to do that. So there got to be something else. Yes, ma'am.
Again, kind of off topic, but
About Canva, I got no answers.
the class this afternoon sounds wonderful, the all that. But I also want to attend the elders' wives meeting. I can't go to both.
It looks like we are recording a lot of these. I don't know where they'll be made available at, but I'm sure they will be somewhere.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to be in two places at one time too.
Yeah, I can't
How can
either.
we find out where they'll be available, how, that we can get to them?
I don't know. I'll find out. I'll ask somebody smarter than I am.
I know sometimes they have, look like a little flash drive you can buy or something.
So we have a YouTube channel, and a lot of these videos are posted on that YouTube channel, the AFCC YouTube channel. Some of the trainings from other schools have been posted, or workshops have been posted on there. So yeah, it's a great resource.
Is it called again? Is the Cowboy
Yeah, American Fellowship of Cowboy Churches.
YouTube channel?
YouTube channel. Yep. They're probably not as technical as some of the big fancy churches, but we do the best we can. Cowboys and technology, right? So who comes from the largest church in the room?
I'm cross-brand, so I'm.
Yeah. Y'all the 800-pound
But you
gorilla.
said, yo, they got money. We live paycheck to paycheck.
Everybody does.
I mean, it's just, and that's my job, it's like, whoa, how we do it, but we've been blessed.
Yeah, and God's moving in all of our churches, right? In some way or another. I don't understand it either. It seems like everything we touch, God just breathes life into it, right? I can't explain that. I do know it's Holy Spirit, right? It's unexplainable, but it's phenomenal. And all of our churches are that way or will be that way, right? So it's just wonderful and phenomenal. But I just know that as God gives it to us, we got to do something with it, right? Because we're not designed just to hold on to that stuff.
It pays our bills.
Ma'am?
So it pays the bills.
Yeah, that's it. It's important to pay the bills. Them bills are important.
Well, I'm not from a big church. Ours is about 100, we have about 100 people. Rafter J, Hope, Arkansas.
Yeah.
And we got a new pastor coming in
Yeah.
April 6th.
Yeah. What's his name again?
Cole Turner,
Yeah. Yep. I knew that. And how long have you guys been at church?
15 years. I've only been there about 3.
That's awesome.
Our pastor that retired, he'd been there since the beginning, so.
I can understand that. Yeah, that's awesome.
We got a new generation pastor coming in. He's like 32,
That's awesome.
33. I think it's just going to be like,
That's so awesome.
yes.
Yeah, it's
Hope, Arkansas.
Rafter J.
Cowboy Church.
We had Rafter J
all churches seem to be growing.
Oh, really?
Our church is growing. We're out in the country at JRC. There's 3 churches in our county, Cowboy churches, and we're probably the smallest of the 3, not well average. And we finished construction on our new sanctuary and stuff in 19, and we're fixing to have to add to it.
Praise God. Praise God.
We were talking at our meeting last Sunday. We're back at 80%.
Wow.
Our growth is, we're seeing anywhere from 8 to 16 new people every Sunday. Then they'll all come back.
Right.
But they're coming to visit to see what it's about. But
That's
a
how
lot of
ours
them are staying.
kind of,
We're bumping up 180 every Sunday, and that's great for our church,
area.
where we're at. And it's just, it's fascinating.
Yeah, it's just God.
Yeah, exactly.
End of the day, it's just God, right? All right, so any more questions? If not, we can all scan the QR code, right? We're going to all scan the QR code, right? And then we can go where we got to go. Because I don't want to sit here and just stare at each other for an hour.
Thank you, buddy.
Thank you, sir.
You.